Welcome, everyone. I'm Abe Eshkenazi, currently the CEO for the Association for Supply Chain Management. I'm pleased to be joined today by Alastair Charatan, a supply chain expert, and Doug Kent, our EVP for the organization. And today we're going to be talking about tariffs. Probably everybody has been aware in terms of the news over the past couple of days in terms of the tariffs that were imposed on Mexico, on China, and on Canada. What we've learned today and late last night is the tariffs on Mexico and Canada have been paused. Those to China have continued to be implemented, or the plan is continuing to move forward on that. Obviously, we saw China's response earlier this morning in terms of what their, protectionism or what their response is to our current tariffs. Obviously, this is a fast-moving target that we've encountered in the supply chain and caused a tremendous amount of uncertainty for a lot of organizations. So we're going to unwrap some of the issues that we're facing today and hopefully gain some insight in terms of what organizations can do and hopefully to respond to what future tariffs or the lack thereof and what the implications are for organizations, for their staff, and for obviously for supply chain as a whole. Alastair, let me start with you. 3 weeks ago, we had a conversation about tariffs, and at that point, it was wait and see. We didn't know specifically what the tariffs were going to be. Well, with the latest tariffs on again, off again, give me a sense of what you're seeing in the marketplace and what you're hearing about the current, sort of temperature of tariffs.
Well, I think the temperature is high, that's for sure. And I think, things have moved an awful lot faster than you and I predicted a few weeks ago. We thought it would be more measured, more planned. We did say there could be tariffs and there could be a reaction to those tariffs, retaliation, and we've seen all that in a matter of days. And so, as you say, now tariffs are off again. So it has been a really, really confusing picture. And let's not forget that President Trump has been saying an awful lot about Europe, and he feels there's a very unfair balance of trade there. He's used some very strong language as usual about that. And reading in the press over here, the European Union are well prepared for retaliation. Apparently, they've got a lot of plans in place. So it does seem as though no one's going to roll over and take these tariffs, and that's very damaging for all parties. So we can only wait and see.
It's interesting when you talk about, sort of the various regions, whether it's Mexico or Canada or EU or China, there are specific industries that each one of those represent and have different implications. Doug, give me your sense. Which industries are most at risk when we're talking about Mexico and Canada in this particular round?
Yeah, well, generally speaking, the industry sectors that are going to be most affected are going to be manufacturing at large, retail, and agriculture. But it does differ a little bit depending upon which country and what level, to Alastair's point, what level of retaliation that we're talking about. I think if you look at commonality, if we just take a look at North America right now, I think if I were in the automobile industry, for example, I would be very concerned. A considerable amount of both the volume of a bill of materials, but also the cost of those materials are coming from a foreign nation, even for automobile manufacturing that's done in the footprint within the US. The more electronics, for example, that are part of our automobile cost today, of course, being imported from Asia, but a considerable amount of products coming from Mexico and also from China. If we take a look at, or in Canada as well, and if we take a look at, Canada in particular, wood products, massive importer of wood products, given the amount of forestry in Canada that exists there. So definitely some concern relative to industries which have heavy wood content, construction, and industries of that sort. Mexico is just an interesting thing. I mean, we just came out of this massive consideration of the de-risking within the China Plus One strategy. And so you saw a lot of companies de-risking by making the placement of those new factories into Mexico. And we certainly see evidence of the increased growth relative to that. So unfortunately, it's to Alastair's point, I don't know if we're out of we just kicked the can down the road a little bit, right? We don't know what's coming back. But these are multi-million-dollar shifts in a supply chain footprint, in particular for Mexico. They're going to have devastating impacts on the industries that made that choice, thinking that, of course, these tariffs either would not happen or certainly to the degree that they're being stated at the moment.
It's interesting, Doug, Alastair, and I want to follow up on that. Go ahead, Alastair.
Yeah. I was going to pick up, I think what's also interesting from what Douglas says is that so many of these examples, companies can't react to this and change stuff. I mean, if you're a car manufacturer in the US, which is where President Trump wants you to be, manufacturing in the US, and you're importing, as you say, a lot of your bill of materials comes in from other countries which are liable to tariffs. I mean, these are not parts you can just suddenly switch at a moment's notice. They may be safety critical, they're specialist technical parts. And so what's going to happen? You're going to have a bit of a discussion with your supplier and say, hey, can you eat up 25% tariffs? And they're going to say, no, we can't. And so what's it going to do except put up the price of the car, which ultimately hits either the US customer buying a US made car, or it hits your exports because your cars become more expensive. So it is very hard to see how these tariffs work in any sort of long-term kind of economic, to get any sort of economic transformation, which in other cases in the past tariffs have been intended to do. But in this case, it just seems very knee-jerk and very, very difficult to react to.
Alastair, I'm glad you brought that up, because obviously switching costs are significant for organizations when you have long-term supplier relationships. In certain cases, we've been able to build up inventories to buffer against this. I mean, this is not, the discussion about tariffs is not new. I mean, President Trump has been talking about this since the kickoff to the presidential elections here. But there are certain activities and there are certain inventories that can't be, bulked up and that we can't increase. For example, the amount of food and produce that we're getting from Mexico right now, you can't build up the inventory for it. So is the discussion on tariffs, this has been around for years. Is this different this time when we're talking about tariffs in terms of the impact and what we're trying to achieve with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest difference this time, without wanting to get too political, but the biggest difference is that really no one knows what the heck these tariffs are for. I mean, they just seem to be, a baseball bat threatening people. And it's not really saying, I'm really concerned about the balance of trade here. I feel that we need to build up this industry more. There's none of that normal sort of measured, planned sort of objectives to tariffs, which can influence behavior, as the Mexico kind of example of Douglas, was a good example of that. The original trade agreements with Mexico and Canada, now torn up, was very much to incentivize companies to bring to reshore or nearshore manufacturing, and companies follow those incentives in a way. But in this case, it just seems to be that kind of seems to be totally random who's being punished, who's not, who's getting the tariffs. I mean, 10% on China seems pretty modest compared to 25% on Mexico. Why is that? So again, very, very hard to react to these.
Doug, you mentioned a little bit about the various materials and the various increased costs on it. Are there specific industries that you're more concerned about versus other industries? Example, as you indicated before, we spent a tremendous amount of effort and investment on moving a number of activities to a reshoring or a regional supply chain. Are we unbundling our regional supply chains and focusing even more on just our backyard? Or, give me a sense of what the global supply chain and the impact is going to be, to the industries.
Yeah, and I think if we take a look maybe at Mexico first, because again, the biggest recipient country of this de-risking and the China Plus One strategies, obviously a very close ally. Well, we used to be, maybe not now, but a relatively close ally. Obviously, transportation costs and sustainability factors play in there as well, because we can move things over and across the Laredo border. We recently saw that the volume of those increases really justified that there was nearshoring that was happening there. But we can't forget the broader macroeconomic impacts that these things could have, because the reality of it is 35% of Mexico's GDP is coming from exports to the US. If that suddenly has an impact, which creates a demand shift and a sourcing shift, as Alastair mentioned earlier, these macro factors have huge implications relative to job stability, relative to recession on both sides of the border. So that's super concerning. Probably one of the unique ones as it relates to Canada, and then I'll talk China very quickly, but Canada also, we import about 10 to 15% of our branded pharmaceuticals from Canada. This isn't a play on which supplier I have. This is years worth of development that goes into the creation of a pharmaceutical or a raw ingredient used for pharmaceutical and medical instrumentation production. So the medical pharma industry, I think, is also super at risk. China is in also a very unique position relative to certain metals, tungsten, for example, which is huge for us in terms of some larger machinery and equipment, but also in the creation of military devices, et cetera. They own 80% of the mining and processing of tungsten, right? So these things can have really, really devastating impacts if we start to become so insular, or we start changing our sourcing strategies as a result of these, to use Alastair's point, maybe not so well thought out in installing these kinds of tariffs without really understanding the broader implications.
Interesting point. And Alastair, I'm going to come to you because I think you've had some personal experience with this with Brexit in terms of the shift away from that regional supply chain into a much more local supply chain. What are the learnings that we could maybe start to see as we move down the line here in terms of additional sort of exclusion of certain territories or partners? What are the learnings from Brexit?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to sort of say there is that uncertainty is the one thing, and we all know, everyone here knows that uncertainty is the worst thing for business. If you've got a measured tariff, it's been announced, you've been given notice about it, you understand what the tariff is trying to achieve, then you can make decisions and look at alternatives. When you're getting tariffs which are switched on, they're switched off, they're 25%, they're 10%, kind of all over the place. It makes it very hard to plan. And I think the parallel there is that in the UK, when the UK voted for Brexit, to leave the European Union back in 2016, it was the uncertainty which really compounded the impact of that, because for year after year, frankly, the government didn't know what they were doing. They didn't announce clear policies. They didn't have an agreement in place with the EU. And therefore, companies were looking at the UK as a place to do business and saying, well, we don't know, is there going to be big trade barriers or not? Are we going to have free access to the EU or not? And for that reason, I think it definitely had a big impact on investment, because companies just thought, why are we going to take a risk? Of course, we're not going to take a risk. If we put a factory here and then find there's a really hard Brexit with really big trade barriers, we can't take that risk. So I think that's an important parallel. I think the other thing with all this is that everything is linked up. And as you gave a good example there, Douglas, about Mexico, well, if it ends up with Mexico with factories closing or having to be mothballed for a while, or other impacts on trade and so on, ironically, that's going to make more incentive for people to kind of migrate to the US illegally, because they're going to say things are getting even worse here. And look, whether that's thought through, who knows? We've already seen pretty shocking scenes. I mean, not shocking, perhaps too strong a word, but very surprising scenes in Canada of audiences at sports events booing the US national anthem when it was being played. And that's quite surprising to see a close ally, kind of really that amount of sort of antagonism created. And that's going to hit, US products. People are going to be thinking, well, it's unpatriotic to be having a glass of US whiskey, switch to Canadian whiskey. You're going to get, ironically, these things are not going to go away. The tariff might go away within a day, but you've caused a lot of upset and insult, frankly, and that's going to be damaging, longer term, I think, or medium term for some of these particular sectors.
Doug, we always talk about supply chain professionals' dream, and that's perfect order, demand, and perfect visibility here. Uncertainty, as Alastair pointed out, creates a tremendous amount of anxiety for our supply chain professionals, for supply chains. So give me a sense on where companies are going to feel it, and give me a sense on where consumers are going to feel the uncertainty here. What do companies do in the short term? And then can consumers do anything in the short term?
Yeah, I mean, optimistically, I'd like to think we're learning from the volume and the variety of disruption that's happened in this post-pandemic world. It's, of course, not just a pandemic now. There are all these geopolitical factors which are increasing, again, the volume, the variety of disruptions. So hopefully we're getting a little smarter about building strategic resiliency into our plan. Certainly China has seen tariffs imposed on them before. And China has responded to that. Their level of diversification on export trading partners is much higher than Mexico or Canada, who wouldn't have expected this sort of rhetoric to turn to reality quite so quickly. So I think, that's a concern. But if we take a look, if we take a U.S.-centric view, I mean, kind of playing off Alastair's point, if these things are bilateral, right, then buying American goods also becomes very expensive. So inadvertently, what we may create is a loss of demand. Yes, and Abe, to your point, we'd love to see equality between supply and demand, but in a world of uncertainty, that most certainly is not going to be the equation. We're going to see demand outstripping supply and supply outstripping demand. The impacts on that we've clearly seen through a lot of these disruptions, and it could create job loss. No doubt it's going to have, undeniably is going to have impacts on consumer pricing. And also when you have uncertainty, we saw it very, very much in the world of the pandemic, uncertainty on transport, for example, and where goods and, when you have these shifts and when you have demand and supply shocks happening simultaneously to the system, the flow of goods does not keep up. And when the flow of goods doesn't keep up, that means it becomes more costly. And you're going to see not only the cost of goods potentially increasing as a result of tariffs, but the cost of transportation, the uncertainty of transportation. Consumers are going to feel pricing impacts. They're going to hate the fact that when they want a good, it is not available. The inventories that have been pooled up will save us for a little bit of time, but not very long. I mean, 3-4 months at maximum, right? And of course, that worsens, as you mentioned earlier, if we're talking about shelf life or perishable goods, et cetera. You can't build up inventory of bananas or eggs or things of that sort, right? And even pharmaceuticals have a shelf life associated with them, particularly those used in things like clinical trials and things of that sort. So, uncertainty is never going to be good to the market. All the analysts have already said their expectation of a return to some degree of inflation as a result of this is probably the most certain thing we know so far.
Alastair, let's dig into this a little bit. As supply chains, we depend on partners and we depend on long-term relationships with partners because, again, you have committed suppliers and, tier one, organizations that are, contractually committed to you. Now we're entering into a period of, I don't know if this partner can be my partner in the future, or it may be cost prohibitive. Supplier diversification was a significant issue coming out of the pandemic. What are the things that organizations can do to mitigate risk beyond just supplier diversification?
Well, I guess, I think the first thing is, supplier diversification is something like that I think a lot of businesses are going to have to look at more carefully now. And it's sad because a lot of supply chain principles, you've got to balance risk and contingency, but for a lot of supply chains, you build up your trusted partners, they have technical expertise, you get economies of scale by not dividing your supply. And so, but I think, people will need to look more carefully. But it may be that some companies also have alternative suppliers, which and the alternative supplier may be more expensive, but suddenly put in a 25% tariff, and that alternative supplier is a lot more attractive. So there may be, kind of already in supply chain networks, some ready solutions, which will add cost, but not as much cost as 25%. So that's kind of one thing to consider. But of course, the other thing is I think we discussed in our last episode was to look at what your manufacturing footprint might be in the US, and it may be that you can switch from 1 shift to 2 shifts, 2 shifts to 3 shifts, and actually expand your capacity without having to have a huge delay and so on. So there are things like that again, which maybe businesses have looked at and felt, well, there's no need to do that. They prefer to have a balance of maybe a Mexican supplier and some domestic production, but now there's going to say, let's move it all to domestic, but which is, I guess, the sort of direction that President Trump wants it to go. But it would be nice in a way if those if those directions were sort of set as being the clear goal of government, rather than being a sort of indirect thing off the back of unrelated issues like fentanyl and migrants and things like that, which are not supply chain issues.
Doug, you brought up Go ahead, Doug, because I wanted to follow up on
it's the whole jobs thing, right?
Yeah.
So at the same time, you're saying you move demand domestically, but the reality is we're at relatively historic low unemployment. And then there are a lot of jobs that are going to be needed if, in fact, the deportation plans actually happen. And that's at a skill level that I would say we do not have the volume to backfill on either. So this is going to, again, just continue to add to the disruption. Just by, instituting factors that you believe will increase domestic production, we have to remember that the labor force can't necessarily keep pace with the skills and competencies that are necessary to fill some of the holes that will be created by these activities. So it's not just like, oh, we suddenly can flip the switch, and we clearly saw this on some of the things that were happening with the CHIPS Act and things like that. Yeah, we can start to build factories. It doesn't mean we have people that have the skills and competencies to do the work that is necessary just because we decide to make the investment domestically. That's a very naive consideration, I would say.
And actually, can I pick up on that, Douglas, as well? Because again, it's another great example where, great example. It's not a positive example, but it's a real example with Brexit, where there have been real skills shortages and real labor shortages in basic industries. I mean, in warehousing and logistics, there's been a huge shortage of warehouse workers because so many of those workers were Europeans who came across, at the time legally, because EU freedom of movement was a well-established principle. And so you had a lot of European workers in warehouses. And ironically, there are people who come over. Some might settle much longer term, but young people would come over, work for a few years, then head back to their own country. And that's been a real shortage. And it, on the positive side, you could say it's a good incentive for automation and developing new technologies, but these take years. This isn't something you can do overnight.
Thanks for providing us the case study, Alastair.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Let's dig into that a little bit, because there have been some positive aspects in terms of the government's, sort of perspective on the chips or electric vehicle batteries with, credits and significant investment opportunities for organizations. As we've discussed before, Alastair and Doug, nearshoring is poised to uplift a lot of industries locally within the United States. Obviously, when you're bringing in those size and the scale of what we're talking about. Do we have the infrastructure necessary to support nearshoring and reshoring today? There's been a lot of constraint on trucking. There's been some constraints in terms of the trucks themselves as well as drivers. The challenge that we have with, the chip manufacturing in, coming to Arizona is that we don't have enough workers. Going back to your point before, Doug, about, the labor aspect of the supply chain. We're going to have to invest significantly more in the infrastructure. It's not existing. This is a long-term investment, not a short-term investment. How do we balance these short-term investments, with the long-term need of the infrastructure and the investment that we need today to support the industries that we're talking about? Doug, give me some hope here that there is an opportunity for us to do so appropriately and in a measured way.
Oh, I'd love to give you hope. I'm going to instead probably give you a little bit of reality. I think that and again, not to politicize it, but the previous administration had a big focus on building effective infrastructure. And I think, it's not just the infrastructure, as you and I have discussed on many occasions as well. It's also the technology that could replace more manual efforts. But you've seen some unusual things. You saw it certainly with some of the port strike activity, which, by the way, is also unprecedented, right? We've had more port potential disruptions, civil unions, et cetera, that were threatening the flow of goods than we've had, historically. But one of the pushbacks, as you might recall, on one of the more recent strikes in the East Coast and down in the Gulf of Mexico for the ports in the U.S. at least, was a reversal of the natural norm, which is to run towards technology as a way to build efficiency and automation. And instead, their pushback within the contract was to say, we don't want automation to enter into the game because then it disrupts and displaces jobs, right? So we've got to figure out that equation as well. And it's not that automation is necessarily the answer, but the biggest concern that I hear from the executives as part of the association is, can talent keep pace with technology, and can we introduce it? And of course, alongside of that, have the infrastructure to support the flow of goods, particularly if there's going to be an increase in volume, and particularly if there's going to be a change in the modality of that delivery. Mm-hmm. If we stop importing from China, our port volumes are going to go down on, LA and Long Beach and et cetera. But the amount of truck drivers and trucks that we need to move things across the border from Mexico might go up, for example. But that's, of course, assuming we don't imply 25% tariffs. So, all of these things are, it's a multitude of variants in the equation, but it clearly is the focus on ensuring that, the infrastructure, the job, and the workforce that can utilize effectively the technology to be introduced all need to keep pace with each other.
Let me flip the coin here a little bit and identify, as organizations evaluate, obviously supply chain professionals have been looking at the tariffs and various disruptions. Doug, you brought up, it's not just tariffs. I mean, we're dealing with geopolitical, we're dealing with, the port strikes, we're dealing with, obviously conflicts across various regions. We're trying to optimize and increase our efficiency and our continuity to ensure that we meet the consumer's demands. Give me a positive aspect, Alastair, that tariffs can help in optimizing and ensuring business continuity. Is there a bright side that we can take a look at in the long run that tariffs may benefit from?
I think tariffs, as part of a clear long-term industrial strategy, they can have their place. I would say that is where they can be used well, in a sort of measured way to provide the right incentives. But having said that, I mean, tariffs are a very sort of one-dimensional, kind of way of trying to negotiate, if one says it's a negotiation sort of between nations in a way. And kind of, for all the fact that President Trump was the author of the art of the deal, this seems to be, how not to deal, because we all know in negotiation, you're trying to create value. You find things that are kind of one counterparty can give more willingly, which is valued by the other counterparty. And like that, you create value. This is just kind of one-dimensional. I'm putting a 25% tariff on. Either you pay it, or the pays it, or the customer pays it. Where's the value add? None at all. But I think, back to your question, I think the only positive I would say is it can be part of an industrial strategy, and it may encourage people to say, okay, I really want to put more manufacturing back in the US. I haven't got enough people to do it. Maybe now is the time to invest in more automation, which can increase also productivity and can have some benefits to GDP as well. So those are some of the small positives.
And I think, Abe, just to add to that, I think, it's important that we do think about the strategic aspects of some trade imbalances that exist and how we can make them more balanced. But it needs to be in a measured, structured, strategic way, not these knee-jerk reactions, as Alastair referred to them earlier, right? That's not helping the situation. But to be fair, there are imbalances that could be corrected, but perhaps with a more strategic plan jointly put in place by trading countries. And I think that recognition perhaps is one of the positives to say, maybe there are some corrections that we need to do here. Let's just do it where we're not disrupting country relations. We're not impacting cost of goods, which are important to everyone. So I think that that's perhaps the positive, is the recognition, which of course is the first step to recovery, right? So let's hope that that's part of the equation.
Yeah, Doug, you brought up a good point, and I want to reference a comment that you made earlier, and that is, the shift away from low-cost labor through technology and through automation that we may be, able to experience, that benefit. But these are long-term strategies, not short-term strategies, and the tariffs appear to be a very short-term strategy to get either some agreement or some concession from your trading partners here. How do you balance the long-term and the short-term objectives here? Because obviously we want a long-term sustainable supply chain. It benefits everybody, benefits the consumers, benefits our economy. The discussion that we're having right now, tariffs appear to be much more short-term than the long-term. How do we balance those, Doug?
I won't give you the answer I really want to say. I think it is by getting a diversity of opinion by leaders, and not letting, one less thoughtful approach be the way to go. And I think you're seeing that right now. I think part of the pullback from 3-day implementation to a 30-day consideration is a little bit of a diversity of opinion. Other strategic leaders bringing knowledge forward that would suggest that these knee-jerk reactions could have devastating impacts. So that's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping a little more diversity of opinion, people looking at this as a multifaceted approach that, if done incorrectly, could inadvertently not do whatever the intent was to begin with. It may not actually manifest itself because of the other impacting factors that could be created without having a thoughtful approach with a diversified opinion of other people who can bring in other points of view which are valid.
We could continue, obviously, this conversation, and it's almost temporal that we just need to look at the latest news to get some additional insight in terms of some of the things that we're dealing with. I want to thank my co-hosts here, Alastair and Doug, for joining me today. Also want to let everyone know that we're going to keep the discussion going. On February 20th, we are hosting Optimizing Sourcing and Supplier Relationships in a Tariff Risk Environment. I'll be joined by trade expert Tom Cook, will provide some comprehensive insight on strategic sourcing and supplier management in this dynamic environment. I hope you'll join us then for ASCM and ASCM.org. Thank you again to Alastair and Doug, and all the best to everyone. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you.